Mark calls his new book a generational memoir, noting at the outset that the path of his public life as a progressive advocate, politician, lawyer, and author has roughly tracked the political arc of the United States from the 1960s to the present. Indeed, as a New York Times reviewer wrote, Mark has, quote, played an outsized role nationally as an original member of Nader's Raiders, as an operative and advocate for a liberal agenda, and in appointed and elected positions as an innovative public servant. Mark says he's finally done with electoral politics and can write candidly about the past, which he does, with lots of interesting anecdotes and reflections. But the book is a welcomed read, not just for its honesty about the past, but also for the hopeful message it delivers about the future. The title is Bright Infinite Future, and the main argument is that there's a rising progressive majority and a new progressive era in the United States as a result of demographic and social trends and the Republican Party's lurch to the extreme right. That's very reassuring to hear, especially now during this very scary, depressing presidential campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Green.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here, Bradley, and thank you for the very kind introduction, notwithstanding the implication that I no longer look young. But you saw something on the cover. And thank you all for coming, especially the George Washington of the consumer democracy movement, for some reason chose to promote his book tonight, where I live, at Union Square, rather than my book here. But if he is the George Washington of this movement, I'm honored to be here with the Hamilton, Jeffersons, and Lafayettes, and Rob will be sharing the stage with me, asking some questions, who succeeded the one and only, she's not just a building, although they named the building, but Joan Claybrook has been a friend of mine for 45 years, because although it's really built on that she's my landlady when I come to Washington, need a place to stay, it's built on, like all relationships, mutual admiration and education. I constantly learn from her, and I hope grammatically, whatever, I contribute to you. All right. And when you called me one of the leading public interest lawyers of the generation, that would be true if Alan Morrison weren't in the room listening to that, because Alan is the leading public interest lawyer of his generation. John Richard, who now works so closely with Ralph for so many years, over 17 years, not 7, not 17. How many? Yeah, okay. And Harvey Jester and others, I can't see that far. I am not interesting enough to have written a memoir. However, it comes out of two beliefs. One is, every author is told, write what you know about and what you love. Okay, a memoir. The ego, actually, none of us can ever be called egotistical again after Trump. I mean, we're also modest compared to this. But second, I came across two quotes about the same time that crystallized the arc of my public life, which parallels and intersects with the arc of the progressive rise. It's not cause and effect, but I've been witness to it. And in 1953, Leonard Bernstein, the famous conductor and progressive, said, quote, "A liberal is someone who believes in a bright, infinite future," close quote. 2 years later, entirely separately, Bill Buckley started the National Review, and his mission statement said, "A conservative is someone who stands athwart history yelling, 'Stop,'" close quote. I said, that's it. I mean, genetically, intellectually, I guess two sides have similar composition. But one team, historically and currently, wants to go back to what? I think when women had to get their husbands okay for credit cards, and there was separate restaurants and restrooms by race, and the Cuyahoga River caught fire. I don't know if that's exactly what we want to go back to. And although liberals and Democrats can make mistakes, as FDR said in the most powerful definitional, foundational speech I ever read about in the 1936 Democratic Convention, that better to experiment and make, I'm paraphrasing, and make mistakes than be frozen in the ice of indifference and callousness forever. So, the reason I'm not that interesting personally is so I grow up in a relatively white suburban community outside of New York City. And I'm the son of two Republican parents, moderate Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans. For those of you who are young, a moderate Republican is a dinosaur which kind of died out in, help me, the 60s or 70s. But you could have a conversation with them. In fact, no one knows better than Joan, maybe 20 to 30 senators in the 1960s could vote for or against a civil rights bill or environmental protection agency, depending on the context and the moment. Now, how many could go either way? 2? If Maine is still a state, it's like 2 or 4. But then I went to college at Cornell and Harvard Law School, and 2 things happened. Everybody has their moments. Jessie Norman, the great singer, told me she saw Marian Anderson on television and said, "I want that." Well, for me, it was in 1967, there was this Vietnam War, and I was of draftable age, and I was an intern for Senator Jacob Javits. Before there was Schumer, there was D'Amato. Before there was D'Amato, there was Javits. And I was an intern in nonpartisan, he was Republican. And I organized and got 189 people to sign a petition to President Johnson saying, you know, this is immoral and stupid, and you should change your policy. I mean, a guy named Bob Reich, others of my generation, Hillary and Bill preceding us on the Hill by a year, signed it. We sent it to Johnson. The result was he canceled his annual talk to summer interns, government-wide, and the House ended not the war, but the intern program. They abolished it for 3 years. And I thought, well, this is fun. Is this what happens? A couple of years later, I'm in law school, and Ralph is recruiting new Nader's Raiders, as they were called, to join him, called me. I hadn't met him before. And he said, be my intern. I said, well, I had this really hot job with Mayor John Lindsay. And long and the short of it is, he said, okay, you want to make coffee or policy? Ralph Nader is very persuasive. He could be wrong and he would persuade you. Is that correct? Do I hear an amen, Alan? Okay. And so I went to work with Ralph for 10 years. If I'd gone with Lindsay, you know, I would have, I would have ended up a New York politician or, you know, something like that. But no, I came to Washington. And Ralph is complicated, sort of. He's very simple when you get to know him. He's an anomaly, and there are people in this room who know him as well as I, but not many outside this room and outside his family who know him better. He's a small town, personally humble, very polite person. Personally. How that mixes with someone who is completely, globally fearless in pushing what he thinks is something that I'll never quite figure out. But people who have said, oh, you shouldn't have run in 2000, you shouldn't have done this and that, he did it because of his ego, are completely missing what Ralph Nader is. He's never said to me, wow, did you see me on the cover of Time magazine? I mean, every politician I know gets their oxygen by how many times the New York Times, Washington Post mentions them. To him, it's all about, not an abstraction, it's social justice, which he was into when he worked in his parents' restaurant, when he was at Princeton, when he was at Harvard Law School, studying Indian rights and auto safety. So he came to Washington not for civil rights, like so many did in the Kennedy years, but for what he called body rights. And went to work for an assistant secretary of labor who was also interested in auto safety. His name was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Ralph wrote a study. And then something occurred that has hardly ever occurred before or since. He went from a complete no-name overnight. The night was when he testified for an auto safety bill, and the committee compelled the chairman of General Motors to testify under oath and apologize to Nader for investigating and trying to smear him so his anti-Corvair, unsafe at any speed work would be undermined. And at that moment, he became nationally famous. A white knight, could have stayed in auto safety his whole life, which he did, but not exclusively. He invested his extraordinary popularity and fame, and he's like a walking Google, intelligence, to 50 issues where he had people in this room and others write the definitive book on pension reform or land use in California or water safety and air pollution. And so he multiplied himself rather than stay exclusive. And it was that decade that I met so many of the people here in this room. And so he says, okay. And I'm saying to myself, he's now going to tell me what I'm going to be doing maybe for the rest of my life. Okay, I want you to lead an effort against corporate crime and corporate unaccountability and antitrust violations. And it's going to be you and two people against several $1 billion of corporate lobbying and advertising. And I thought those were daunting odds, but I had no choice. That was my assignment. Now, I had luck in that some of my colleagues working with me was a man, the late Bruce Wasserstein, who would later grow up to be a titan of Wall Street, Joel Seligman, who went on to write the definitive 5-book series on the SEC. And basically, if anything occurred with the words corporate accountability or corporate governance or antitrust, we would learn it, so we became the go-to people in that field and changed a lot of law in the process. Second, he created, I don't think it's occurred anything like it since, the Congress Project. Joan and Bob Felmuth headed it up. So, of course, there was a 666 question questionnaire that Bob Felmuth wrote, and members of Congress said, really? But they felt compelled to respond because it was Ralph Nader. And it helped shake up Congress a lot, and we believe reduced the threshold for cloture from 67 to 60. And third, it led to a lot of campaign finance reform finally after Watergate. In other words, the preconditions were worked on, and then it happened. And he had asked me, and I got lucky. I co-authored a book with Jim Fallows. If any of you want to learn how to write, co-author a book with the leading journalist of your generation. And so we wrote Who Runs Congress. It was a #1 bestseller, the largest selling book in American history on the Congress. But God has a sense of humor, because here I am writing that money is corrupting Congress, our democracy is for sale. And I end up, and I'll get to in a second, in New York, drafting the small donor matching funding law that's now a model in the country. That is, if you give currently up to $175 and you're a voter, the city matches it 6-to-1. So when you're talking to a $175 donor, which is not a lot of money, it's a lot of money to an average American, but not to a major political campaign, it's like $1,000. So you can say no to big shots, because a lot of, now the small donor thing has metastasized happily because of first Howard Dean and then Bernie Sanders, et cetera. But of course, the joke was that I end up running under my good law, in a primary where all of us spent the same amount of money that I won for the primary for mayor. And then I ran against a man named Michael Bloomberg. I lost track of him. Whatever happened to him? He seemed so promising. In the 9/11 mayoral election. Which brings me to New York, where I left Congress Watch, where I succeeded Joan, who went to run the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration agency under President Carter, and I became the head of Congress Watch before Rob now is the head of Public Citizen, which includes Congress Watch. Ralph was very supportive of me doing it because, look, you can, I thought I can write about and advocate and go on television and write books, or you can make history and policy, as he first said to me. And so there I was in New York, and I ended up being a commissioner. And I remember thinking, a commissioner, a local commissioner, what's the big deal? And then I realized, what am I saving myself for? I had subpoena power, 300 staff, which is a lot of fun. Anybody here have subpoena power? I mean, it could be done poorly or well, but in the 11 years that I was the consumer commissioner and the elected public advocate, it's the #2 job in New York City, we got Joe Camel ads eliminated. It was the second most well-known brand in America to the Marlboro Man. We filed a petition with the FTC, and 7 years later they agreed with us that it was inherently misleading to seduce teens into thinking that smoking was sexy. I sued Giuliani because he wouldn't disclose files of cops who were violent and were substantiated to be violent, and forced their disclosure. Protected women in the workplace and in divorce by enacting state and local law, protecting women who were often the, quote, unmoneyed spouse in divorce proceedings where they were just at a career and financial disadvantage. I have to admit, it was fun fighting with Rudy Giuliani. Now, this is before he showed his complete racist colors by saying, what's the problem with police misconduct? The problem is black on black crime. Before he said that Barack Obama, I don't really think he loves America. The thing about Giuliani is either you love him or he hates you. And so on day one, I figured out, okay, this is going to be fun. And for 8 years, weekly and monthly, we kind of went at it legally and politically. And then occurred what I write about in the book is called the 9/11 election. Look, I've seen a lot of elections. You win, you lose, you give a concession speech, you move on. That mayoral election, not because I was in it, was the most unusual election at any level I've ever read about. Now, Bush-Gore was pretty interesting. Not so much the election, because they were both kind of moderate at that time. Bush was the, across the aisle governor. The post-election months was, of course, fascinating because of Bush v. Gore. In this election, it started out that 2 years before, allow me this story, 2 years before the election, 1999, I turned to my wife, Denny. We happened to live 100 yards from Gracie Mansion on the Upper East Side. I said, honey, I'm going to run for mayor. You never know. I think I'm going to win because of record recognition, resources. But you never know if an external event will occur that's unpredictable that could change everything. I start running. And we have a primary of 4 equivalent Democrats, all known citywide because of their offices or borough-wide, under the campaign finance law, which limits spending. We all raised the maximum, spent it, and I won in a runoff. And then the general election was against Mike Bloomberg, who, all jokes aside, he started the general election 25 points behind me. I said to my staff, like, what could go wrong? You know, you really, if things are going badly, you have to fight back. If things are going so well, you try to scope out what could go wrong. Well, the greatest attack on American soil in the city where I was running had not occurred to any of us. It happened on the primary election day itself. The night before the attack at 846, it sounds like I'm making this up, but it's true. September 10th, late afternoon, Bill Bratton calls and says he was a friend who was supporting me. He said, hey, you want to meet tonight for drinks with John O'Neill and me? No one knows security better than John O'Neill. He ran the bin Laden unit at the CIA, and now he's the head of security at World Trade Center. I said, you know, let me meet him later. I just want to calm down. Primary night, think I'll do well, and I'll meet with him later. I say to my wife, honey, just like I said 2 years ago, there's been no external event. Nothing intervened the flow of what I thought would happen, and it looks very good. And so at 846, I'm at 6th Avenue and 10th Street. It's opening day of school, shaking hands with new parents with their kids. Hey, vote today, which is an exciting thing for a candidate. Usually you say vote for me or whatever, but when you can say vote today, it has a kind of electricity. And I saw a woman pass me walking north. She was walking south, rather, and she gasped. I looked up, and so before I saw it on television, before I heard commentary, I look up, and I see 40 blocks north, fire billowing out of the World Trade Center. Then, of course, the second attack, and then we knew what happened. John O'Neill was killed an hour after the first building fell, so I never met with him. And it shaped two numbers shaped that mayoral contest. First of all, it really reshaped New York City, because 12 years of Bloomberg, who was a extremely smart, competent guy, and by many measures a successful mayor, it reshaped New York City than if I had been mayor. And when he had spent $50 million, which was the most ever in world history, in current dollars in an election, I was still ahead of him. But he ended up spending $74 million. My pollster was Mark Mellman. I'm sure many of you know him. He's a leading Democratic pollster. Called me with about 20 days to go. He said, I have good news and bad news. The good news is you're 20 points ahead, and I've never had a candidate 20 points ahead in a general election who's lost. And we all know good news, bad news means bad news. So I said, what's the bad news? He said, well, he's spending $1 million, not a month or a week, but a day. And he's catching up a point a day. I'm no mathematician, 20 points ahead, 20 days to go. I went, what can we do? And the answer is you can do nothing. Usually you want to respond, so Hillary and Trump respond based on what's happening. But other than Bruce Willis, like stealing his money, digitally or actually, in Die Hard 3, he could spend his money. So we tried to respond in the ways that we could. So it's election night, and the final poll had a 45-45 with very little undecided. And so I'm in a suite with all these people, my family and friends, and Bill Clinton, who was a friend and a big supporter. And I remember thinking I had a victory speech and a concession speech, and I was in a private room. And for 15 minutes, I was emotionally paralyzed. I often don't fret. I was born without a gene for self-doubt, which is good and bad. But there's nothing quite, I guess the only greater moment is if you're waiting for a verdict in a murder trial and you're the defendant. That's a bigger deal. But there I was, frozen. He wins by 2 points, the closest election in New York mayoral history. In the book, I try to describe what it's like to run and lose. We hear, we all love the Rocky who wins, and, Adrian. But it's very rare to see to feel what it's like to be in the shoes of a candidate who almost wins and then whoosh, you don't. First, it's the repetitive motion of stump speech and money and disciplining yourself every day, that if something happens, every day something will happen that makes you think, I can't win. Or, hey man, I can't lose. Neither is ever true. And you gotta wake up the next day and just ignore the high and the low and keep going, something I learned from, seriously, sports growing up. But when you're driving a car and you pass a wreck on the side, there's been an accident, there's a family out there, somebody may have been hurt, and you say, we all say, I'm glad that's not me. This was me. It was like, wait a second, I'm the guy in the wreck. And how you handle it is phenomenal, because if you lose the girl or the guy or the job and you walk down the street, who knows it? When you lose the mayoralty of New York and you walk down the streets of New York, everybody knows it. So everybody will look at me and go, huh? Now, 99% of the people will then say, I voted for you, which is statistically unlikely. But you really have to use the current word, power through it, which brings me to 2016. And the book's long-term thesis is that there is a peristolic momentum based on social and political trends, which will nearly, anything could happen as I learned, inevitably make Hillary Clinton a comfortable winner. The reason is that when I was in the 1960s, I thought, this is the way it always is. It turns out, that was my present, turns out it was an unusual decade. In terms of the politics and creativity that it just exploded with, are reaching across the chasm of history and tapping us on the shoulders today. And so the women's rights movements, we're not going back. And the pro-gay movement, we're not going back. And actually, the drug reform movement, it took a while, but we see what's happening in terms of not incarcerating young men who make a stupid mistake, which is often has racial disproportion. And the consumer movement that Ralph was involved with, and corporations having to respond. The anti-war movement. This has led to a country that lurchingly is more liberal over time. And look at the issues today. Now, this campaign, presidentially so far, has not been about issues, and we know why. One of the candidates is so goddamn interesting, and that he has trivialized and mesmerized the media so much that it's not like a great debate on what we should do militarily or what have you. It's been at the slogan level, and it's been a challenge to a woman we know who's kind of a logical, empirical lawyer on how to debate verbal diarrhea. It's not easy. I've debated a lot of the conservatives, but Buckley and Buchanan, they were energetic, smarter than hell, but you could have your space. It's proving hard. But the reason I am extremely optimistic is not the daily stories. 2 days ago, a week ago, Hillary was falling because she used an adjective as a noun. You can call people's views deplorable. You probably shouldn't call people deplorable, or her word, irredeemable. And then she did something that no candidate should do. She got sick on video, and we all saw it. And then comes Trump having to back away from the birther thing in a complete stunt, and we saw what he did. And that looked like it would start to remind everybody what a con artist he is. And then comes 3 separate, relatively small terrorist attacks, which led to no deaths, but the Chicken Little Republicans, instead of trying to think through terrorism, just raced to the green room to get on cable to talk about it. And oh, that struck you. And so the long-term view, though, and then let me turn to Rob, I'm sorry, is that the GOP is arguably sprinting to the right because of the Fox effect, safe districts where incumbents are afraid of a challenger from the right, not the general election, while the country is erratically but steadily moving more to the left. And this clash between that party and this country is going to doom them unless they change course. They tried to after 2012, when they were told you got to appeal more to Latinos and minorities, you can't win in a country that's, and they couldn't do it because anybody who out-extremed the other, like Ted Cruz, grabbed the headline. So number one, the GOP near suicide. Did you see Reince Priebus yesterday said anybody who doesn't support Trump can't run for president in 2020. It's like, you know, he's Putin. He's not Putin. I mean, Trump is Putin, but he made his run at it. And so the GOP suicide could lead, I think, to a near Democratic landslide because of the disjunction between the country and that party. Two, as Ron Brownstein, a former narrator and writer at The Atlantic and elsewhere, has written, there's a blue wall, 18 states, which in 6 straight elections have produced 242 electoral votes for the Democrat. Different elections, different nominees, obviously. And so that's a hell of a start for a normal Democrat to get to 270. Third, we're an increasingly brown and minority and millennial country. Millennials just exceeded my generation in numbers, over 70 million. They are 55-35 liberal, incredibly, you know, liberal on gay rights and women's rights and climate change. They voted 3-1 for Obama over Romney. And the rise of millennials and minorities and professional women in the suburbs who, you know, may be Republicans by birth, but are looking at a party where you, of course, Trump once said we should penalize women who have abortions. He can't unscramble that omelet. These are trends that are independent of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. When you add these up, there are trend lines that I don't, independent of the candidates, that will buoy the Democrat. Finally, there's Trump, who has his talents. I've seen this. I'm in a city with, I don't know if you remember, Billy Martin was the Yankee manager, and Rudy Giuliani was the bellicose mayor. So I've seen this prototype. And however, he is going to taint the Republican Party as the anti-Latino party, the anti-young, anti-social liberal party, even though he's probably socially liberal, his party isn't. For decades, you know, millennials are going to be voting for 50 more years, like Alan and me. This is going to be a recurring disaster for them. Conclusion, well, anything can happen, and it did on 9/11. It's very likely, depending on the first debate, that Hillary Clinton would win by the same 4 to 7 point margin that Obama did in his 2 elections. She will do worse than him because she is not as dynamic a candidate. Who is? There are 2 Democrats in my lifetime who are like, you know, beyond talent, and it's Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And of course, he generated a special enthusiasm and turnout among minority voters. However, Hillary Clinton can net votes because of white women who were nervous about Obama, but kind of like how Hillary has stood up to the slanders and the attacks over the years. But she does not have a Lehman Brothers to collapse and start the Great Recession during the election that Obama had. Conclusion, you can start walking up. Conclusion. Okay, let's see how it ends. The two big issues in this country are not, I mean, thank God they apprehended the likely culprit in the New York attack, and 320 million people, who knows what else could happen. But the two great questions from the 60s to 16, and this is an election that will break it open. If Democrats have won 5 of 6 popular votes in the last 6 presidential elections, if they do it again, and presidents 42, 3, and 4 all won re-election, and Hillary Clinton wins re-election, it will really break the back of the increasingly right-wing Republican Party, the anti-minority party. So, who picks up the pieces of the Republican Party? Will it be Trump, Breitbart Republicans? I don't like the phrase alt-right, because it sounds like all right. It's not all right. It's the lunatic fringe. It's the only party I know that has a fringe at the bottom. Or is it the more mainstream people that I deal with once a week on my radio show, Both Sides Now, Rich Lowry, Mary Madeline, David Frum, the kind of Ryan National Review, hard conservatives, but not as insane as Trump and Breitbart. So that's the contest. The second question is, should Hillary Clinton win? Who's right? Ralph Nader, who thinks she's a militarist, and what else does he call her? Something else. And a corporatist. Or is she someone who started with the Children's Defense Fund out of law school, as I started with Ralph out of law school, which is a marker? Is she Wellesley or Wall Street? Is she transitional and happy that she's the first woman president? Or will gender rather than agenda satisfy this woman? And that remains to be seen. Then it's up to Rob and Public Citizen and all the activist groups in the country to make sure that she continues this progressive era. Thank you very much. I'm bowing. Thank you. Rob Weissman's been the head of Public Citizen for 7 years and has done an extraordinary job and is one of the leading, among other things, pro-democracy advocates in the city and the country. And my last question, who's the real Hillary Clinton, who's come out for appointing justices? She has one litmus test. It's not even abortion. It's overturning Citizens United. And will she be able to push for a democracy of more voters and less money? And I turn it over that and a Q&A before you ask questions to Rob. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we're going to be quick in our Q&A, but before we start, I will say that, to your surprise, I actually have read the book, and it's a really nice book. It's a really, that's not surprising, because you're an extraordinary writer, but it's a very nice tale, and it is self-deprecating, and it is interesting to read about the losses, not just the wins. Well, one thing you said struck me, though. So, it would have been a different New York. How do you think it would have been different had you won in 2001? Bloomberg only had 19 days, and he didn't catch up, and you won. What difference would you have seen in the city?
Believe it or not, I've rarely thought about that. Clearly, I'm not Mike Bloomberg for good or bad. As Bing Crosby has said, a Sinatra comes along once every few generations. Why did it have to be mine? And so this was such a unusual guy in terms of wealth and et cetera. He had called Social Security a Ponzi scheme. He loved big bankers and resented how anybody would talk so much about income inequality. He needed a GPS to get to the so-called outer boroughs to meet middle and low-income people. It was not his social set. He started out anti-gay marriage, but like, by the way, who here when they were 5 was pro-gay marriage? In other words, everybody changes. He was a little late to the party. And so he was a kind of third way, no labels, moderate Republican who ran as a Republican, switched to be an independent. I don't know what he is now, but he's not, but he has policy positions that are similar to Democrats. But, my agencies would have been run by people like Joan and Alan. But I actually, for emotional protective reasons, don't wake up every day, oh man, I would have done this. Short of a time machine, doesn't work.
All right, well, let's talk about one thing that you did do with the consumer agency and then as public advocate, because you cover a lot of decades in the book, so there's only so much space on this, but it is extraordinary, and it's actually I think it's a useful lesson for people who look at government and sometimes wonder, you can see all the bad things that are being done, but what actually affirmatively could be done. You had a position that really didn't have very much power, and you did quite a lot. So maybe you could talk about some of those things, and also sort of what are lessons about, not just that we're particular to being public advocate, but to have an elected position and finding a way to make a difference.
Thank you. There's only one elected public advocate or ombudsman in the country. It's in New York City. Different companies and different local governments have ombudsmen people who, from the Danish kings, were supposed to watch over the reign because the king couldn't trust always his ministers to listen to what the people are saying. President Clinton and I got to come to New York on Kick Butts Day, a thing we started at the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. I gave it to them, and they've been running it wonderfully every April for 20-odd years. He said, oh, thank you, Mark, for inviting me. You're the public advocate. I envy you because I want to be the nation's public advocate. That was a good day. If it's a bad day when I think what I would have done if Bloomberg hadn't won, it's a good day when the president said that. So as public advocate, I figured out I got elected. I don't work for Giuliani. I'm not going to be impeached. I have subpoena. I have certain powers as commissioner and public advocate. And so I just turned it into a Nader-like public interest law firm by, if we see a problem, just what's it called in the military when you flood the zone, football or in the military, and you use overwhelming force. And so when women from Westchester, not even New York, visited me that they were getting discriminated against in divorce proceedings, we did a whole big deal exposing it. The matrimonial bar hated me. But Judith Kay was the chief judge of the state, and she was a friend. And the state courts draft state law in effect on divorce. So she adopted all my reforms. I got help from Gloria Steinem and Monica Getz in our fight. On the other side was the matrimonial bar, and we won. And on tobacco, the city wouldn't support me, the general counsel of the city, when I said, gee, cartoon ads are inherently misleading. He said, well, it's First Amendment. I said, it's not First Amendment, it's commercial speech. And so I went to the Federal Trade Commission, and as I said, years later, they voted 3-2 to follow a staff recommendation. And the next month, R.J. Reynolds ended the joke. And by the way, it didn't change America, but of course that, with everything else that the FDA had Kessler and Henry Waxman did, has reduced children's smoking by a quarter in this country. And once you're addicted, it's a lifelong, if not life-ending habit. Implicitly, you raise a very important question. The key to Hillary Clinton's success, should she be president, is not just her transition, her agenda during the transition and subsequent to January 20th. She has to break the fever in the country against government. And this has been from King George to George W. Bush to the Murray Wiedenbaums, all the economists, the American Enterprise Institutes, who basically say regulation has all these costs, the cost of unintended consequences. But their formulation, as you know, leaves out the benefits of economic or externality regulation, meaning, cars, auto safety, environmental safety, workplace safety. You can, I can't believe it, 1,000 times I've heard Republicans give speeches. The problem with our economy is big government and big regulation. Now, of course, that existed before the September 07, 08 near collapse. So it didn't cause it, it was consistent with it. It was a steady state thing. But they get mileage out of this by people who hate government. Hence my quote, which is more extensive in the book, of what FDR said, because it explains it perfectly, which is, listen, when government tries to do something, it can screw up, it can regulate. What's how they do it in workplace safety. A ladder is something that goes up and down, so you can mock it. She has to figure out how once a month she has to visit an agency and have someone who says, my family's alive because the airbags deployed the way they were supposed to. When I was watching all these people denouncing Ralph, in 2000, this sounds like I'm circular here, but it's not. In 2000, I'm a Democrat. I was a ranking Democrat in New York City. I endorsed and supported Al Gore. Ralph said, oh, come on. I said, oh, come on. You're the principled guy. I can't support a candidate who could stop the Democrat. So I'm on record with that. But for all the people who hate Ralph because of what he did as a principled thing, he didn't do it to elect Bush. He did it, to advance the progressive cause through a third party. So I asked Clarence Ditlow, who runs the Center for Auto Safety, as a colleague and a fellow traveler of John and Joan, analyze the reduction in deaths per mile driven from 65, when the agency was legislatively enacted, and when did it start? When did it open its doors? 66. In the half century since, based on the reduction of death and injury per mile driven, there are 3.5 million Americans who are alive today who would be dead. So Clarence came up with that number because I wanted a quick soundbite to answer the critics of Ralph. Now, it's also due to auto safety signs and all kinds of other things. But it reminds people how affirmative government can save lives and dollars. And we have to cite the ADA and the civil rights laws and Social Security, how the Republicans are against government. So I have friends politically, like Mary Madeline, who's on my show. She's the most generous person I know, a practicing Catholic. She loves helping people, but not through government. And once government touches it, suddenly it becomes wrong. Well, you can't hate government and love your country in a self-governing democracy.
These guys want to open up. Let's ask one last question. So you talked about the system in the campaign finance system in New York. And as you know, notwithstanding the Bloomberg experience, it is held up as the model. But it's not a model we've been able to replicate very well. What do you explain, how do you account for the failure, it's really our failure, to have it emulated outside of New York?
Now, the model didn't include Bloomberg because, as Rob knows, and as Alan knows so well, because of the Buckley, Citizens United, and McCutcheon decisions in the Supreme Court, they kind of are saying money is speech. It's not speech. It's property. I mean, money doesn't talk. And we have time, place, and manner restrictions on elections. You can't have a bullhorn at 120 decibels at midnight in a residential community. But be that as it may, the Republican Party, you see, more voters and less money would kill off the Republican Party. If there was a straight election, an Oxford Union debate on the merits on these issues, Democrats would win 80% of elections. They can be competitive when they subtract voters from the progressive coalition. which disproportionately means black and brown and now Asian voters. And while we have an occasional George Soros, he's a piker compared to the Koch brothers, who have a net worth combined of $100 billion. Let me repeat, it's $100 billion. And so they will fight to the death, and the leader of that fight is Mitch McConnell. He's no Rob Weissman. He has, though, some advantages. And he's the plaintiff in some of these cases, and they will locally and federally oppose this. And so when Citizens United is reversed, and it will be. Sorry, Floyd Abrams, you didn't say it was off the record. I saw him at a party. I said, he is a liberal, brilliant, famous First Amendment lawyer who on principle grounds represented so-called Citizens United in the Supreme Court. I said, isn't it going to be inevitable when a Democrat wins and replaces, this is pre-Scalia's death, inevitable that it's likely a Democrat will win, and when he or she, somebody replaces a justice, they'll reverse Citizens United. He said, yes. You never know, but the day that Samuel Alito replaced Sandra Day O'Connor, not a good day for these and other issues. But then the issue is thrown into the legislative arena because, okay, you can't spend unlimited amounts, but how do you get a matching system, or is it Seattle, where they have vouchers with taxpayer money that each citizen can spend their voucher, you correct me on this, for any candidate they choose, so it's a small donor matching system. But the Republicans say it's welfare for politicians. It's food stamps for politicians. That's a very effective slogan, right? What's your counter slogan? You're working on it.
I'm asking, it's your book.
It's my book, oh yeah. Well, you have to buy the book to find the answers. Rob, thank you very much. Anybody have any questions? And please have Rob answer or a follow-up question as you see fit. Harvey Jester.
Well, I was just thinking about your comment about how 9/11 was an exigent event that affected your campaign in, what, 2000?
2001.
2001. What do you think, suppose that Trump's really does have an alliance with Russians, and that's one reason he won't make his tax returns available, because they're large investors, oligarchs over there in many of his enterprises. What sort of things do you suppose he could be cooking up with Russians just before the election that would help him as opposed to and hurt Hillary?
That's a fair question. You know,
in the same way that 9/11 hurt you.
I don't know everybody in this audience. I know Harvey and others. We don't like to lie. When we make a case, when we do a fact sheet, when we lobby, we have, here are the facts, here's our arguments. And so when people compare Fox and MSNBC, I go crazy because I know Rachel Maddow very well. I ran Air America for a couple of years. She would rather shoot herself than, she'll make mistakes, lie on air, which is, of course, what Trump does tactically. And so you're asking a question for me to rationally explain. When we are on the brink, I'm confident, but confidence is the feeling you had before you knew better, said Mencken. I'm confident, but who am I? Are we a democracy or an idiocracy? Idiocracy was the name of a movie, which is painful, but it's what happens when, like, really stupid people run things, and it's rather chaotic. There are all these studies that show that once you take a belief, if you see data that contradicts your belief, you get more ardent in your belief. which is very sad for people whose lives are dedicated to advocacy. So, when Trump said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, it wouldn't change the minds of my voters, which basically he's calling them deplorable. But when he said that, he was right. And so here's a party that for generations lunched off attacks on communist Soviet Union and Russia. Now that they have a nominee who is slightly pro-Putin compared to we read about that, they go, it's okay. They're both strong. In other words, they can't even acknowledge the utter disparity in their views. Now, I admire few more than I admire Katrina vanden Heuvel and her husband Stephen Cohen. They're married. She runs The Nation magazine. Raise your hands if you're a subscriber. Love it. It's the most important liberal magazine in America, historically. She and Steve wrote a column that Democrats who attack Trump as being in bed with Putin are engaged, in their words, the new McCarthyism. I had dinner with them about 3 weeks ago. I said, what the are you talking about? McCarthyism is when a powerful person smears an innocent person wrongly. They're not communists. Putin is not an innocent victim. He's the head of Russia. And so, not to mention that if it's politically advantageous to tell the truth about Trump and Putin, and he's telling lies about our side, we're not going to use that. It's accurate. He won't criticize Putin. And so we had a really good intellectual fight. We're all friends. We ended up friends. Of course, they're for Hillary Clinton. But to shy away from your question, so I think, how do you force Trump to disclose his taxes, his loans, possibly to Russia, et cetera? It's hard because he's a bulldog, and you got to be really creative. Maybe you have a Buffett, a Bloomberg, Meg Whitman, Mark Cuban, have a press conference and say, we're probably wealthier than Trump. We disclose our taxes, et cetera. Why won't he? In other words, get validators other than Hillary Clinton, who has a self-interested motive to do it. But the rules are upended this year because it's not Trump's agenda, it's his persona to angry white guys, and I don't buy this stuff, it's not race. Are we in a depression or a great recession that is creating more economic anxiety than before? No. It's largely generated by, in my view, in the book's view, more importantly, the book's view, not just my view, but my memoir's view, that it's a backlash to Obama's success. Worse than having a black president to a lot of white guys is having a successful black president, which should destroy any premise about white supremacy there and then. My answers have been too long. Yes, sir.
This will be the last question.
You're getting a microphone.
Do you think, given your premise and your theories about what could happen with the election, do you think the ultimate thing that could seal the deal with Hillary is this first debate?
I'm sorry, the ultimate ticket would still deal with?
Yeah, what I'm saying, for people that are undecided, could it be the first debate between Hillary
Seal the deal.
and Trump
I see.
that could seal the deal?
Here's the
her
problem.
election?
Here's the problem. In a real debate, normally the person who is more experienced at debating, more experienced on the subjects being discussed, more intelligent on the subjects being discussed, more honest in her answers, would have a big advantage. We know who that is. And I think what I just said is not partisan, but is empirical. I mean, look at the 100 Republicans who won't endorse Trump for that reason. The problem is this guy has skills, and they're television skills, and they're sort of debate skills. I saw a debate on Charlie Rose, on television, between Paul Krugman. There is no one smarter than Paul Krugman, certainly not on the economy. And he debated Joe Scarborough, former congressman, now Morning Joe. It was a tie. Because Scarborough knew when to be a little witty, drop a quick untrue thing, or drop 3 untrue things, jamming Paul, who couldn't respond succinctly to 3 lies in a row. The problem with the debate is, could Trump win the debate because he continues the pattern of avalanching lies which won't permit Hillary to respond one by one, because then she'll be on the defensive the whole time. Will he intimidate Lester Holt? He's already tried, saying, I hope Lester Holt is a fair moderator. And there's a whole debate now about what the moderator should do. Should they correct or not correct? There is, and finally, Trump could win by beating expectations, which means people don't expect much from him because he's such an idiot. So they're going to reward him when he's better than an idiot. That is real both sides-ism. So there's a chance that he could exceed expectations and throw her with, and I'm not involved in the Clinton campaign, but I have friends who are. She has to figure out how to decode and decipher his MO of a river of lies, assuming no one catches up. I have some good news. The American media for 40 years doesn't like there's no the American media, but the established media, the Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, that you give equal space to major party nominees. You try to be fair and balanced. It's not working in this election because every day Trump says 7 things that are startling, wrong. He apologizes the next day. He says it's a joke. He says it's sarcasm. He says he doesn't mean it 5 years later. And so far he's getting away with it because of the polls. Saturday's New York Times, I just jumped up and down. I'm a parochial guy. When he on Friday, before the weekend, had a press conference lulling Jeff Zucker, CNN, and all of them to cover 30 minutes of promoting his effing hotel for 27 seconds of saying that the president is an American, the American president is an American, after saying the opposite for 5 years. I waited to see what the major media would do, and they changed. They changed their paradigm. PBS, Nightly News led with, Donald Trump today admitted he had lied for 5 years. They used the word lie. The New York Times the next morning, again, New York Times is not going to decide this election, unfortunately. Big article, but it was a news analysis, but it looked like an article. Trump admits his lie but won't repent. And the article tore him to, it wasn't like, oh, Mark Penn wrote a memo that may have implied that Obama's exotic. It killed him. And I believe that the American media, their intelligence has been insulted by this guy. He's played them. No one's ever done what he's done. I mean, Father Coughlin did it, you know, as a popular demagogue in the 50s, but no candidate has ever done quite what he's done. And Reagan did a version of it. But he was authentically a generous, charming guy. He was. And I think the American mainstream media is so pissed off and is finally going to not fret that they're going to be attacked as the lamestream left-wing media. They've been bending over backwards for years. And I'm hopeful that in the next 6 weeks, especially the debates, they aren't balanced but truthful. And if someone lies, they say it. But the debate, it's not a slam dunk for her.
Thank you.
Last question.
I'm
Olga.
Sorry,
That
I'm
was an
afraid that-
attack on busboys and she said one question maybe from a woman. Please give her the mic. Oh, you don't give mics to women?
Yes.
What?
I think I have a short answer. Question, I hope. I've read someplace recently that, and I think probably most of us in this room will agree that most Trump voters are pretty marginalized, economically, educationally. We all know the story. And they've been lied to, and they believe these lies because they think that America's going to be great again. So therefore, this is their man. And I've also read about this, that should he lose, I'm not saying one way or the other, okay, should he lose, these very people who are already losers, marginalized economically, are going to be a huge, huge part of the American population who have once again they've lost their man, and now we somehow have to deal even more with the issues of this underpopulation that we have in this country. And we all know that it's there, and they're going to feel more marginalized by losing their man. I don't know if you have a response to that or not.
Yeah, I've been told to have a short response by the terse Joan Claybrook. Hillary got in trouble for saying half Trump supporters are deplorable, alt-right, nativist racists. She apologized for the numeral, not the noun. She couldn't back away from saying that a lot of them have racial intolerance. Bright Infinite Future ends with a chapter that subheadline is The Fringe Fourth versus the New Progressive Majority. You look at the data, and 53% of Republicans think Obama was not born in America. Now, a third of Trump voters think the South should have won the Civil War and Japanese internment camps were justified. A majority of Republicans think reverse racism is worse than racism. In other words, they never even got to racism before saying reverse racism was worse. These are crazy marginal views that probably won't go away should Trump lose. And the challenge for the Republicans is, what do they do with a group of older, largely white people, not only older, but who are pulling their party down to presidential loss after presidential loss? I don't have an answer, and it's their problem. And the challenge for Hillary Clinton is not to be smug and say, we're better for you, we're going to help you, but figure out the FDR democracy thing. We will help build an economy for all, not an economy for a few. And the Bernie Sanders success showed how popular, a lot of Democrats are afraid to say increase taxes on the wealthy. Sanders showed how it's morally right, economically right, and politically smart, right? She has the challenge of basically saying, I am going to help close the wage gap. Obama hasn't for 6.5 years. Wages are now rising. Real wages are rising for lower income people. Poverty is falling in the last couple of Bureau of Labor Statistics reports. So she has to brag that since 1960, half the time Republicans ran the administration and half the time Democrats. Since 1960, growth, jobs, and GDP under Democrats has been 30% more than Republicans. That's a number. You want to live like a Republican, you got to vote like a Democrat. That's a real number. It's not just my tax plan and your tax plan. And she has to pledge to do everything she can to reduce income inequality and to close the wage gap. That's not abstract. And if in 4 or 8 years, in fact, people are doing better who have been marginalized, that could lead to a realignment not unlike the white South when they walked after the civil rights laws from the Democratic Party, when they realized who Democrats were for, and they moved into the Republican column. That was a realignment that changed the South, of course, and the House. And we could have a comparable realignment if she can unlock that economic box. Thank you. Buy the book. You're not going to be disappointed. Rob wasn't. Thank you very much. Thank you to Busboys and Poets. Thank you, Rob Weissman. Thank you all for coming.